Their sheep, they were sacrificing their sheep, or when they were ill, they weren't taking care of them, or they weren't going out and searching for them when they got lost. They were not being what a shepherd was meant to be. In fact, we find out that there's really no such thing as a bad shepherd. You're either a shepherd or you're not a shepherd. And so God condemns, God calls out, He judges the leadership on the nation of Israel and says that He is going to come, that He is going to raise up shepherds. He's going to raise up new leadership, and He's the one who's going to bind the sheep. He's the one who's going to go search for a sheep. He's the one who's going to go find the sheep. He's the one who's going to lead His sheep to pasture. He's the one who's going to lead His sheep to still waters. He's the one who's going to lead His sheep to lie down. He's the one who the sheep are going to find freedom. He's the one who the sheep is going to find the source of life. He's the one who will provide for the sheep everything that the sheep need. No longer is it going to be the leadership of the nation of Israel, but it's going to be through God, through the designated leaders that God raises up at this point in history. It's foreshadowing to a time when the Good Shepherd, John chapter 10, verse 11, we haven't even got there yet, where Jesus makes this unbelievably audacious claim. He makes this ridiculously outrageous claim in John chapter 10, verse 11, where He says that I am the Good Shepherd. Now again, if you were a first century Jew, if you were the intended audience to hear this quote, to hear this phrase, to hear this claim, you would be deeply offended. Why would you be deeply offended? You have been waiting literally for thousands of years for the coming Messiah. You have been waiting literally over and over again. You have been given the task of keeping Israel pure. You have been given the task of making sure that the nation of Israel was keeping to the law. In the Old Testament, moving into the New Testament, that religion was coming to be known as Judaism, where they observed the law, but they found freedom through the law, or they found salvation through the law and not through Christ. This is where Jesus comes in. This is where later Paul not condemns the law, but shows the law. It's fine to observe the law. In fact, it's good to observe the law, but true salvation, true life, true freedom happens through Jesus and Jesus alone. And so Jesus makes this audacious claim, this outrageous claim. He offends, and literally he's standing up saying that I am the coming Messiah. I am literally God in the flesh. You would be deeply offended. No wonder they called Jesus a blasphemer. No wonder they called Him a sinner. No wonder at times they called Him demon-possessed. This man is standing up like an absolute lunatic, claiming that He is, in fact, God. But on the heels of John chapter 9, Jesus just got to deal with this blind man who's been blind from birth. And the Pharisees and the custom of the day believed that if you had a physical ailment, if you were blind, either you or someone in your family has grossly sinned. And so this man who was born blind, Jesus spits in the dirt, if you remember, makes some like mud cake saliva mix, throws it on homeboy's eyes, and he's told to go to the pool of Siloam to wash himself. And when he washed himself, immediately he can see. This man doesn't know who Jesus is. We know that, in fact, by verse 11 of chapter 9. He says, I think that people call Him Jesus. The Pharisees brought Him in, and they're beginning to question Him because He can now see. And they're asking Him how He saw. He said, this man named Jesus, I think that's who they call Him, He healed me. Further in verse 17, he goes on to say, he's going to say, well, I think He's some sort of prophet. Now, I don't know if He's a sinner or not, because the Pharisees are claiming that Jesus is a sinner. They're claiming that He's a blasphemer, even indicting Him on the fact that He may be demon-possessed. This blind man who, again, in verse 11 says, I think his name is Jesus. In verse 17 says, I don't know if He's a sinner or not, but all I know is He healed me. I was blind, but now that I can see, now I can see, and I think He's some sort of prophet. Well, they kick Him out. Long story short, they kick Him out. Jesus finds out that they kick Him out. Jesus goes after Him. Why? Because shepherds always go after their sheep. Jesus goes after this man. He says, why have you kicked you out? He says, do you believe in the Son of Man? And he says, well, who is this Son of Man that you're talking about? And Jesus says, it's me, it's I who is speaking to you. In verse 38, the man says, well, Master, I believe. And the text says he immediately worshiped Him. He goes from saying his son, I think his name is Jesus, to I think he's some sort of prophet, to all of a sudden he says, yes, I believe you are Jesus. I believe you are the Messiah. I believe you are who you say you are, and you can do what you say that you do. And he threw himself at the feet of Jesus, and he worshiped him. When we see Jesus the way God intended us to see Jesus, our only response is worship. We don't even know the blind man's name. I tweeted this out last week. I love it throughout Scripture, over and over and over and over again throughout Scripture. I love the fact that we don't know some of the characters' names. I love that we don't even know some of their stories. We just know a moment in their life. What does that remind us? That always reminds us it's always about Jesus. It's even the characters whose names we do know, who we do know their backstory, who we do know what's happened in their life and in their family's life. The story's always about Jesus. Always, always about one hero. The Bible isn't a book about several heroes. Although we look at Abraham like he's a hero, and we look at David like he's a hero, and we look at Moses like he's a hero, and we look at Paul like he's a hero. The reality is the Bible, the story, the biblical narrative is about one hero, and his name is Jesus. And in John chapter 10, verse 11, he calls himself the Good Shepherd, which is an audacious claim. It's an outrageous claim. We pick the story up in John chapter 10, verse 9. I'll read about John chapter 10, verse 9. If you haven't been here, you're caught up to speed now. John chapter 10, verse 9, Jesus says, I am the gate. He is reiterating something that he's already said in the first half of John chapter 10 so far. He's going back and he's saying, you already heard what I'm about to say, but since you're blind, and this refers back to chapter 9, he says, I've come that the blind may see, but that those who think they see will remain blind. He's specifically talking about the Pharisees. Now, let me say this real quick. Don't raise your hand. But how many in here, don't raise your hand, how many in here have been brought up in church your entire lives? Church is all you know. You've been in church your entire life. Sunday morning church is the only thing you know. You've been growing up. Wednesday night church is the only thing you know. Some of you, not only have you been brought up in church your entire life, but then you've even gone to a Christian institution or a Christian school. You've been involved in Christian education your entire life. The only thing you know your entire life is Christian. That's really what the Pharisees were. They were Jewish. They were brought up in a Jewish family. They were brought up in a Jewish heritage. They were brought up in the religion of Judaism. All they know, their entire context, was the first 5 books of the Old Testament. That's all they know was the Mosaic Law. Over and over and over and over, they knew the laws. They knew the things that they were supposed to do. They knew the things that they weren't supposed to do. And if they did the things they weren't supposed to do, they knew the sacrificial system on how to atone for the things that they shouldn't have done. That's all they knew over and over and over and over. They only knew Jewish heritage, Jewish lineage, Jewish customs because they were born into a Jewish family. If you were born into a quote-unquote Christian family, it doesn't make you a Christian. If you were born into a family that your parents have the faith that we know as Christianity, essentially is a faith that follows Jesus, does not make you nor I, because I was brought up in a Christian home, it doesn't make you or I followers of Jesus because our parents are. But because we're brought up in a Christian home, we automatically live this Christian lifestyle. We go to church. I remember growing up, a dude that I grew up with, he lived literally 6 doors down from me. Christian family, grew up, family that eventually ended up in mass dysfunction. But I remember him specifically saying this. He said, I'm at church any moment the church doors are open. Some of you guys have lived that life. Some of you guys have lived a life that the church doors are open. I'm there. Whether it was for me, or whether it was because my parents were serving, or whatever reason. Because we've been brought up, because we were born into it and brought up into it, we don't learn to know who Jesus is through osmosis. We can learn the Christian ideals. We can learn the truth of the biblical text. But when we really get down to the nuance of the Bible over and over again, we see the gospel. And the gospel simply is it's always through Christ. It's not about knowing about Christianity, knowing about Jesus. It's always specifically knowing firsthand in deep intimacy who Jesus is. What it means to be a follower of Christ. What it means to call yourself a quote-unquote Christian is for those who deeply and intimately know Christianity, you guys often know, if you've been around for a while, I often rant on North American Christianity. In a lot of ways, rightfully so. In a lot of ways, it's kind of harsh. I guess I'll deal with that some other later time in my life. But the reality is, we have made it, quote unquote, easy to be a follower of Christ. And every time we open the biblical text, we don't see Jesus making it, quote unquote, easy. We see Jesus simply requiring to follow him. So in the garden, it says that we are made in the likeness of God. Let us make man in our image, as image bearers of God, as image bearers of deep intimacy, as image bearers of deep connection, as image bearers of deep relationship. We are restored to that. Sin entered.